Next topic will be the open this check. Okay, let's talk about the few things. One is let's talk about dashboard. Let me go here. And I can go to devopsworld.org.in. Okay. So there is a Kubernetes dashboard. What is Kubernetes dashboard? Means you can also access your Kubernetes through dashboard, which we very rarely. Okay. But there is a concept. So there are some steps. If I go to Kubernetes dashboard, so if I go to the Kubernetes deploy and access the Kubernetes dashboard, okay. So here our dashboard will be something like this. So here you can see all the namespaces, what are the resources we are having, right? So everything we can see it here. So for that, okay, so they are using the Helm. Actually, I prefer to come to Kubernetes website to have this because actually they most of the time they change this URL. All right, so Helm we have not discussed so far. Maybe after discussion of Helm, we will see that. We will see some other. We'll see some other topic then. I think we haven't discussed about ConfigMap and secret. Did we discuss? I don't think so.
No, sir, we have not discussed that.
Okay. So let us talk about ConfigMap and secret then. All right. So let us talk about ConfigMap. So what is ConfigMap means? For example, you are having a Docker image. Okay. So you are having one Docker image. And that Docker image is having the set of instruction to create the infrastructure for you, right? For your containers or pod. Now, the thing is that when this infrastructure is created, you are having a configuration file. So configuration file is most of the time the applications have, whether you are having the web application or your desktop application, machine learning also, right? So whatever, right? So now you have created a Docker image, and in that Docker image, you consider this is a web application, okay? And you are having a configuration file, web.xml file, right? And in this web.xml file, you are having a lot of properties. One of the property is the consider connection string, okay, where you are connecting to the database, right? Now you are having different environments. So my first environment is production environment, second is dev, and so on. Okay, so this is my production environment. This is my dev environment. Right? Now this production environment is connecting to a database. Right? It is connecting to a database, which is the production database. Right? So it is connecting to a database, which is my production database. This is my production database. Similarly, my dev environment, it is connecting to a different database, which is the development database. So two different environments, and they are having two different databases. Right. So this is connected. This is referring to this database. This is referring to this database. Okay. And both are running in the Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is using this Docker image. So this is using this Docker image because we cannot say that there are two Docker images. If we are saying two Docker images, then what will happen? That it is uh, you know it is out of the standard. Out of the standard means if a pod is running with a Docker image, its image should be same in all the environment, so that if you make a change in the Docker image, it should be applied to all the environment. Otherwise, you will say, means in my staging it is working, but production it is not working. So it means you are having a different Docker image. So thumb rule is that we need to have the same Docker image in all the environment. Now, if you use the same Docker image, it has a different connection string, which is connecting to this database. Its IP address is different. So it means when you create a pod on your production environment, then what will happen? Then it will be, then it will, you need to make some changes manually or with some process, which is not a good idea, right? Creating multiple Docker images also out of the standard, and the you know manually changing these configuration file for database connection string, that is also not a good idea. So that is why Kubernetes introduced something called ConfigMap. Okay, so they have introduced ConfigMap. So now ConfigMap is somewhere here. Okay. Now, as the name suggests, configuration mapping. Okay. So what is ConfigMap? So ConfigMap is a key value pair. Key value pair storage. Right. So what does it mean? It means that if you want to store some value in the config map, it will be stored in the key and value. Okay. So now, for example, I want to store the DB connection string for production. So I will say DB for production. Okay. And here I will put the connection string for DB. Okay. For production. Okay. Same way, I want to have a connection string which is called DB connection string for staging or dev. Then we will have the connection string for Now these two connection strings are where? In the config map. Now when this pod is running, in the pod I will say take the connection string from config map. So now I am not changing Docker image, but I store that value inside the config map. Same way, if this dev is running, I'm not changing the Docker image and I'm saying use this config map. So that is the purpose of the config map. Let us see here. So if I say kubectl and get config map, right? So here you can see there is one config map which automatically get created when you create your namespace. Okay, so in my namespace, which is default namespace, this is the config map get created. Let us understand the config map first. So that is the one which I have not created. It is automatically get created by the Kubernetes. Now I want to create my own config map. So I will say kubectl and create config map. The short form is CM. Okay, so kubectl get uh, config map and config map name. I will say this is config map 1. Okay, and what I want to do, I want to store some values. So for example, if I say or what we will do, first we will create some file, okay, from web.xml kind of file. Complete file I want to give it to my config map. That is also possible, right? But you cannot give more than 1 MB data to the one config map. Okay, so if you give more than 1 MB, then it will not allow. And mostly our configuration files or parameter files, these are less than 1 MB. Right? It is in KBs mostly. So I'm creating a file which is I will say echo. I will call it as this is production configuration file, something. Okay, and I will store it into the production .xml file. Okay, or I will say web underscore production.xml file. Same way, I will create one more for dev. So I will say dev, and this is my dev configuration file. Okay, now I have these two files. So now I will create a kubectl create config map. Name of the config map, I will say config map 1. You can give any name. Okay, and I want from file. Which files? From file or files? I think from files. From file. I'll check that one. So I'll say take web underscore prod.xml file. Okay, and one more from file, which is web underscore dev xml. Yeah, from file. So now a config map get created named config map 1, and it is pointing to the web production.xml file or webdev.xml file. So now we can check kubectl get config map. So here you can see config map 1 is created and it is having two data. So what is two data? One data is from this file, one data is from this file. Now if you want to see that one, so if I say kubectl get or not get describe config map and config map 1. So here you can see I have config map 1, right? Namespace, it is in the default namespace, and this is web dev.xml, right? This is the key and this is the value. So web underscore dev.xml, which is the file name, it becomes the key, and the content of the file becomes the value. Same way, webprod.xml. Here, this is the key. Prod.conf dot webprod.xml. This is the key, and prod.conf file. This is the value. Right now, I have these two things. What I want to do, I want to create a pod for production. Okay, so what I will do now, you can write the code, or I think I already have that code. Let me go here, ConfigMap, ConfigMap. Actually, I'm creating this pod. So I'll say vi and ConfigMap pod.yaml file. Okay, so I'm creating this pod. I'm using volume because I want to store this file somewhere, right? So now what I have done here, I'm creating a config map, and the name of the config map I will say, name of the pod I will say config map pod for production. Okay, I want to create for production. Right now, container is this Docker image. I'm using this. I'm creating volume because volume I am using this because I want to store this value into my some place inside the pod, right? So I'm saying that I want to store it into some volume. So I'm using, so Kubernetes volumes are much advanced level. So what it can do, it can point to some resource like here in this case config map, and then it can extract that information and put it into some file. Okay, so for example, here you can see the volume name is test volume, which is pointing to config map, and the name of my config map is config map 1, right? So this is my config map 1, and what I want, web underscore, I'm creating pod for production. So I'll say web underscore prod.xml file, and I want that file is to be renamed with the pod web.xml file. Okay, because whether it is staging, whether it is other environment, so all are having the name as web.xml, right? So no, so that's why items, it will check this key and it will rename that path as web.xml. Where I want to mount, you can mount it here in the pod, and the name of the pod is test volume. And here, for example, I want to store somewhere, say, so in config map, we store the non-sensitive information. Non-sensitive information means that information which is not sensitive, means if I run the describe command, others can see it. Right? So here I want to store it into, say, my data directory, okay, somewhere, and it will be read only. Now what I'll do, I will save this. Let me see, is there any pod running? There is no pod. Now if I say kubectl and create -f and cm hyphen pod.here, pod get created. Let us see kubectl get pods. So you can see it is in the running state. Now if it is in the running state, then I will say kubectl describe pod cm pod, and production, right? So here you can see volume, test volume, which is pointing to the config map, a volume populated by config map. Which volume? CM1 volume, right? And it is mounted to my data directory in the pod. So it means if I say kubectl and exec minus it cm pod, it cm and pod, sorry, cm pod prod, and if I say hyphen ls, will it work? Yes, it is working now, right? Now we need to see, we have created my data directory. So I'll say my data. So here you can see there is a web.xml file, right? Now this web.xml file should have production information. So now I'll say cat, and here I will say web.xml. So you can see this is a so it means I have created a pod pointing to my correct configuration file, right, which is a production configuration file, and I make that file, I took that file from the config map from key value pair, and now it is my production pod. It is not picking up that development. Same way, if you want to create a development, then development pod. So what happens that I did not change the Docker image, I did not do anything manual. I just put my information which I want to use at runtime for my pod, like it's a production pod or if it is a development pod into the config map. Okay. Now, similar way, what we can do, we can also set up the environment variables. So if I create a kubectl and if I say run or create config map, say config map 2, okay, I want to create, and now here I want to use from literal. From literal means you are defining the value. For example, if I say environment equals to staging, okay, or you can say stage environment equals to staging, and production from literal production environment equals to production. Okay, so I have created these two environment variable for my config map. Now if it is created, now if I say kubectl and describe my config map, which is config map 2, so here you can see I have key, which is production environment, right, which is having value prod, and the staging environment, which is having value stage, right? Now what I will do here, kubectl, and I can use these environment variables for my pod environment variables, right? Means config map key and value pair I can use as environment variables into my pod. How you can create environment variable in the pod? Kubectl, you can use the run command and just check for the help. Now here you can see there is a help which is saying environment variables, right? So here you can see we can set the environment variable for the containers. So I will say kubectl run, and my pod name is say environment pod, right, with the image Nginx, and I want to just create a YAML file. So I'll say it was --env, and I want to create environment say something, say env equals to value, environment value, variable value, right? And I will say hyphen hyphen dry run equals to client minus o YAML, right? So here you can see environment is created, name is env I have created, and value is value. But I want that this thing should come from my config map, right? So for that, you can use the uh, you know what we call Visual Studio code. There it will help you to write the code, or I already have this. So I'll take this code. So we just need to know the environment prod env and the state env I have created. State env and prod env. So now I will say vi ConfigMap with the environment variable dot YAML file. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll just copy paste this here. Now what I will do here, I will give the name as ConfigMap pod env something, right? Using the Docker image, we'll use Nginx prod env value coming from the config map. Which config map? My config map, which is ConfigMap 2, and prod env. And here also I will say coming from ConfigMap 2 and state env. Let me save this. Now let me apply this. kubectl create minus f, right? And I will say and start my worker 2 also. Minus f cm env. Yeah. So this is created. Now if I say kubectl get pods, so there is a pod which is the env pod get created, okay, and it is in the running state. Now what I'll do here, I will go to kubectl and describe pod and the pod name. So here you can see now we are having the environment variable prod, which is pointing to the prod env, and stage, which is indicating to the stage env. So it means if I say kubectl and exec minus it, and my pod name is cm pod env, right? And if I run the env command here, environment command, so my two environment variables are set, which takes the value from the production and the staging. Is it clear? So basically,
Yes, sir.
what I have done in the config map, I have defined key value pair, and those key value pair I have used as the environment variable inside the uh, inside the pod. Okay, so fine. Now this is config map. Now I would suggest you one thing, that once you go through this topic, go to this one, which is in the Kubernetes documentation, config map in Kubernetes. Right? So here, if you go to this documentation, right, so you will see one example, and that example is mixture of mixture of environment variable and the from file. So this is the example where a config map is getting created and a pod is created on the basis of that config map. So try this example. It will give you more, insights of the config map. And this is a complete example. All right. So do you have some time? Can we discuss secret, or you want it tomorrow?
So tomorrow we can do.
Tomorrow we can. Okay. All right.
So tomorrow can we do? Can we have a class in the evening?
Evening. Okay. Or we can skip tomorrow. That's fine also.
Okay, fine.
All right. So we'll skip.
Monday we'll connect.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Bye, sir.
Bye.